So, hi there. Today I have the pleasure of speaking with Philip Carr-Gomm, who is very well known, I think, both in the tarot community and in the British spiritual community more generally. So, thank you very much for taking time to speak with me today, Philip.
Well, it's a pleasure, Chloe.
And I'm very curious, actually, about what you came to first, actually. Was it the tarot or Druidry, or did they kind of come together, or how did that all happen for you?
Well, I suppose, it's the journey for me started. It started very specifically. I remember it when I was 11, and I read a book called The Life of the Buddha. And it's at the same time I met somebody who would become my first spiritual teacher, who was Ross Nichols, the old chief Druid. And that was sort of East and West, if you like. So the Eastern traditions and the West at the same time, and that sort of triggered the journey. And then the tarot came, I suppose, when I was from an early age I was very interested in the spiritual quest. And I suppose it became clear to me that was the only quest really worth pursuing. And then the tarot, I suppose I came across, when I was 17, probably 16, 17. And then it was the Rider-Waite deck. And of course it was very popular amongst my friends and so on. And what was the other thing? You asked me about the tarot and something else. Psychology, was it? Or
just at this moment, it was just sort of how Druidry and tarot, which came first? Did one influence the other?
Oh, I see. Yes, it was kind of all. I suppose Druidry came first, and then the tarot, and then really, what happened was when I started following a guru for a while. I was interested in all these things: so meditation, the tarot, Druidry, Buddhism, and I started following a guru when I was in my 20s for 7 years, and then it all became a bit odd, and I started to sort of see the shadow side of following a guru, which is basically that everybody's in love with this person, and so very healthy to have a background with about 1,000 people madly in love with one person. Not a healthy dynamic. And I decided to study psychology. I decided to sort of get a bit hard-nosed about it, and so I enrolled in my sort of mid-30s in a science degree in psychology at UCL in London, and studied that. And so I left aside the tarot, and I didn't leave aside all spiritual pursuits, but I focused on psychology, and then I don't know, 10 years later or so, I was asked by the publisher. When I was asked to lead the order, then having finished the degree, I was asked to lead the Druid order and so on, the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids, and I developed alongside my wife Stephanie, we developed the Druid Animal Oracle and the Druid Plant Oracle.
So those came before the tarot?
Yes, I think possibly the Animal Oracle. I can't remember when the Plant Oracle came, if it was before or after, but certainly the Animal Oracle. And then at some point the publisher asked if we would do a tarot, and my initial reaction was to say no, because I didn't feel I was an expert on the tarot. And then, but I sort of sat with it for a while, and I thought, no, this would be interesting to work with. And this idea of beginner's mind.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I thought, what if you approached it with beginner's mind? And that's what I did.
Right. So was it something that Stephanie was also aware of and involved with? Because the two of you sort of figure as co-creators along with Will Worthington. So how did that kind of three-way dynamic work?
Yes. Well, that was interesting. What happened is actually Stephanie is an artist and a scene painter. So she worked for a long time for opera houses, painting scenery, and so she has a very good visual mind. So what would happen is that she would suggest the images. So say an obvious one is, say, the the Two of Swords, which in the Rider-Waite deck you're looking front on at the person. They're holding two swords like this.
Whereas in your deck, you see her back and you see the tree and the paths. It's one of my favourite cards.
Yes, that's right. And Stephanie said, sort of move the camera around to the back and look that way, And so she came up, and so we would create what are called briefs. You would write briefs, and we would email. At that time, I was in New Zealand. I went to New Zealand to work on the book because I find that New Zealand has the most amazing kind of atmosphere for writing. It's a kind of crystal clear energy there, which is fantastic. And so I mailed a whole mass of tarot books to myself in New Zealand, then flew there, and then had this fantastic time of working with that. And Stephanie and I would work with Skype every day, and we would agree on the brief, and we'd email it to Bill, or Will as he's now called, in Manchester, and he would work on it, and then he would do drawings, and then he would email them to us and to the art director of the publishing company. And then we'd have a ridiculous sort of four-way conversation where the art director would say, no, I don't think you should do that, and then Stephanie would say, yes, I think so it got quite heated at certain times.
Sounds a little complicated.
But everybody had their role, and there was one fantastic moment where the art director suggested that we did what's called symbolic pips. Symbolic pips are where the Two of Swords, the
symbols like the Tarot de Marseille.
Yeah, yes, exactly, just two swords. And rather than having and so the art director suggested those symbolic pips. And Stephanie held out for symbolic ones, and the conversation went round and round between Manchester, London, Lewis, and New Zealand until it reached a stage where Will and I were ready to give in to the art director, but Stephanie tuned in the 7 at a chariot card and stuck to her guns. I'm so glad she did, because I think it does make a difference having those images.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a big upsurgence in sort of purely symbolic pips these days, but I think back at that time it made it a lot less accessible for a lot of people. And one of the great delights of the DruidCraft Tarot is just how very accessible it is, that it kind of brought that whole perspective to a different audience. And if it had been just with the symbolic pips, I don't think it would have achieved that in the same way. Absolutely,
I agree. And of course, the reason why there's a push for symbolic pips is if you think about the artwork involved, a tarot artist has to create paintings, sort of 76 paintings, which is a huge task. Whereas if you do symbolic pips, that knocks out 40 paintings you have to do, because you just do it digitally, you just reproduce it digitally, and so you save the artist, and therefore the publisher saves money, and so it's understandable.
Because I mean, I know that Will takes a lot of time over his work and really puts his heart into his artwork, so I think it was a project that took quite a long time in that regard, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Still, something absolutely beautiful came out of it. And were you happy with the finished product?
Yes, and in fact, we there were 3 cards that we had great difficulty, and Will would do drafts of them, and we wouldn't quite. They didn't sort of work for us, and he would do other drafts, and then he even painted one of the. What do we call it? Canonos, the devil, and the first painting he did, we didn't like, and it's now in the Witchcraft Museum in Boscastle.
Oh right.
So you can see it there.
And what was it that you didn't like about it?
It just, it's hard to say. When the thing about the tarot, because they're conveying sort of archetypal energies and feelings, sometimes, just the feeling doesn't seem right,
Yeah. No, fair enough.
Yeah.
And so obviously Druidry was something that it sounds like underlay a lot of this. So it was kind of before, during your psychology degree, and afterwards as well. You said that you met the old leader of the Druids order back when you were 11, and yet he isn't the one that you kind of had as a guru. So what was that relationship like?
Well, what happened is, he was a friend of the family, and my dad, he also ran a college in London, and my dad worked as a teacher for him as well. And so I met him when I was 11, and then he would just be around, visiting and coming for dinner and things like that. And then when I was 15 or 16, I became interested in photography, and I had my own darkroom. And he invited me to photograph the Druid ceremonies. And then I would go and take the contact sheets to him in his house, and he would choose what enlargements he wanted and so on. And then we would gradually talk about Druidry and so on. And that was a sort of excuse for us to get together and talk, really, in retrospect. Yeah. And I became interested in this vision of Britain as a magical place. And this image of Druids as these sort of wonderful wizards and sages, these sort of Gandalf figures. Yes. I read Lord of the Rings around the same time too. So, so this idea that there were these magical people, and that and that trees were alive in a very special and spiritual way, was very intriguing and attractive. And so I asked if I could apprentice in it. And I did that, and so from the age of 16 through till he died in 1975, and I was 16 in 1968. So for 7 years, 68 to 75 is 7 years, isn't it? So for 7 years, I trained with him. I would basically get off the train on my way back from school, get off the train at Barron's Court and go, and he'd make me a cup of tea and then would teach me. So I'd do that sort of twice a week or something. And then after 7, then go to ceremonies and all the rest of it. And then after 7 years, he died. And just before he died, I met a guru called Omar Mikhail Ivanov, who ran a thing called the White Brotherhood based in France. And I became fascinated by his teaching, so I started following him. And the difference is that Ross Nichols wasn't a guru. He wasn't a kind of charismatic spiritual teacher. He was a kind of academic, really. He had more, if you can imagine visiting an English tutor at Cambridge or something like that. He had that. That was the quality of the visits, Yeah. Whereas the guru he looked like Father Christmas. He had wonderful flowing white hair and a white beard. And he seemed to have an aura that sort of shone. And he was very dynamic. Sorry, I've got a bit of a cough.
A lot of it going around. I have one too.
Yeah, no, this cough comes from the pepper I had a turmeric latte with pepper. And so it's kind of, yes. And I think in the end, having had these two spiritual teachers, really, in the end, I realized that culture was more important than charisma, because my Druid teacher was cultured. He was very highly educated and intelligent, cultured man. The guru wasn't in the same way. Yeah. He was dynamic and interesting, but in the end, I think go for culture rather than charisma.
Makes sense to me. Yes.
Yeah.
And so, do you actually sort of combine the tarot these days with your therapeutic practice? Because you said you studied psychology, and now I believe you work as a therapist in a couple of different modalities. So is the tarot something that you bring into that, or do you see them as quite separate?
It's a great tool for I haven't combined it with other methods of therapy. Well, I suppose I have, actually, to be correct, but I think you have to be quite clear about how you're doing it. So what I do is if I was using the tarot, that can lead in. What's great about the tarot is it can lead into a fairly rapid homing in on the issue. You have the idea of the presenting symptom, or So somebody might have an underlying issue, but they're kind of reluctant and shy or embarrassed to talk about and so on. And in the conventional kind of talking therapy, it may take you a while to get to the nub of the matter. And if you use the tarot, you can sometimes uncannily home in on the nub almost immediately.
Yeah.
And I developed a way of working with the tarot to do that, which it came about in a very particular way, which was that there was a 17-year-old girl staying with us. With our daughter was doing her A-levels. And no, GCSE. They were doing GCSE, so maybe they were 16. And she stayed with us for a couple of months. Her parents were in Kenya. And one evening, Sophie said to me, our daughter said to me, that she would like a tarot reading. And I was a little reluctant because, teenage girls, family and friends and so on. But they were very insistent and persuaded me. And so as she took the cards, the idea came to me that for just, instead of doing a spread, for just her to select some cards and let's see what speaks to her.
Yeah. And
as she was shuffling the cards, I prayed that she wouldn't receive the Death card or the Ten of Swords. Because, those are tricky cards.
Yeah.
And lo and behold, she picked those two cards and a few other cards as well. And then I said to her, and I was just being sort of guided by my intuition, I think. I said to her, just see these as pictures that trigger ideas and feelings for you, and just talk to me about what you see. And she picked up the Ten of Swords, and she said, this is me. And the Ten of Swords with the 10 swords lined up, it's the, one of the worst cards you can get. It's, or is it the Nine of Swords? The in bed crying. I think it's the Nine of Swords. Yeah. 10 of Swords, they're all in your back, aren't they?
Whereas Nine of Swords is more the nightmare card and things whirring around in your mind and
yes, that's right.
Insomnia card.
yes. And she said, these are the 9 GCSEs. That will be trophies on my wall. And this is me sitting up in bed, worried, stiff about them and stressed. But I know that, what this card is telling me is just don't worry. There'll be trophies hanging on your wall in a couple of weeks' time. And so I thought, gosh, that's a great way to, because if you read the classic interpretation, it says, all sorts of ghastly things, And then she picked up the Death card and smiled. And I actually think I'm proudest in the DruidCraft Tarot. The Death card, I think, is the best. It's compared to the Rider-Waite. It's just so. It's such a beautiful card, and she's got her hand skull. Her hand is very long, and it's very loving. There's a sort of way in which she's holding the skull, putting the skull into the cauldron of death and rebirth, and then there's this sort of wisp of smoke, symbolizing the soul rising up. To be reborn. Yeah. And she just smiled and she said, well, this is the death of my childhood. I'm turning into an adult. And, what a fantastic, So she gave glowing into, positive framing of what she got. And in fact, she's gone on, ended up getting a first class degree at Oxford and all that sort of stuff. And so I started to do readings by asking people simply to pick. So the instruction is somebody comes along and they say they'd like a reading, and you say, well, pick some cards. And then the person inevitably says, well, how many? And you just shrug. You just, and they usually pick, half a dozen or so, and if they pick dozens and dozens, then that in itself is a diagnosis.
Something. Yeah.
And then you ask them to turn them over and just to say what thoughts come to mind. And 90% of the time, people do their own reading. It's quite extraordinary. And so this turns on its head the part of the tarot that I don't like, which is that it can disempower people.
Yeah.
Because people often will consult the tarot when they're going through periods of stress and worry. Classically, relationship problems for women, money problems for men, and sort of career problems. And so people are vulnerable and anxious, and they're looking for answers from the outside. And so a tarot reader is in a very powerful position. It's very easy to disempower the client and for you to seem like the all-knowing person who can be helpful. if the person can give themselves their own reading, this is a really empowering thing in itself. And then you, as the guide, are just there to support them, to create the right atmosphere and so on. Mm-hmm. And then perhaps to just suggest a few things. You know, what happens if you move these cards and move that over there, and what happens then? And does this remind you of anybody you know? Or just little pointers like that.
Is there anywhere that situation is happening in your own life right now? Or,
yes. So little guiding questions that as therapists we will be familiar with. And so I guess, you know, that's how I use it as a way of homing in on issues fast.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, you know, one of the things that I wondered is sometimes it can be tricky. I mean, like knowing whether or not someone might be open to actually having these cards brought out, you know, especially if they've come to you as a therapist rather than as a tarot reader and so on. So that's...
Yes. So, that's what I meant at the beginning. I don't combine them in the sense if somebody came to see me for psychotherapy, I actually wouldn't use the tarot unless they mentioned it.
Yeah.
You know, for instance, perhaps if they knew that I did it from looking on a website or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. But if somebody specifically talked about the tarot and came, then it might morph into a sort of therapy session as such. You know.
Yeah. Absolutely. You've mentioned in this a couple of the cards from the DruidCraft, and I wonder if there are any particular cards from that are your favourites.
Yes, so we've got the death card that I mentioned, and it's funny because I've just worked on a new tarot deck, so that's the one in my mind.
The opera one.
Sorry, the opera one.
Yes.
One? Yeah. That's right. Yes, I have it. It just arrived a few days ago, and it comes in this sort of beautiful box with sort of gold leaf.
Because I saw you talking about that at the UK Tarot Conference last year, I believe it was.
Oh, you were there?
Beautiful last, yes, yeah.
Oh, great. Let me just get a deck and. I sort of brought Lenormand into. I did a novel set in
the Prophecies. Yes.
Oh yeah. Yes.
I haven't quite finished it. I kind of got stuck, and then I had to go off and do some work, and so I've put it down. But I think I'm at the bit where the German soldier is kind of supposed to be posing as Jesus Christ and has reservations, and then he's finally agreed that he's going to do it, and that's where I'm up to in
that. Gosh. Oh gosh, so you've got quite far.
Oh yes, I will finish it. It's just.
Yes, that's right. Yes, it's a very strange book. I mean, it took 5 years to write, I never would have chosen that subject. I mean, when I was sort of, you know, I went into the forest in Brittany, and I was asked to write fiction, and I sort of asked spirit, as it were, for my go, you know, and I was sort of told to write that book. Yeah. And I'm afraid I was kicking and screaming all the way through, because it's such a, I mean, who wants to write about art?
Yeah.
It's dark, isn't it? You know.
It is.
So it's a very odd story. But there you go.
And I mean, I wondered as well whether you used the tarot tool as a writing tool, because I mean, that's something else that people quite often do, using cards perhaps to do a reading for a character to try and see, you know, what's going on for them, or where are they going to next, or, you know, lots of ways that you could use that too.
Yes, and I do know about those, and I've thought about using it, and we used to use it we did some camps, some Druid camps, where you know, people would pick sort of cards to create a little play as a way of creating a spontaneous play.
Yeah.
But I haven't used it myself in solving writer problems. I think the experience of writing a novel for me was so what's the word, demanding, really. You know, having written non-fiction for 20 years or so, I thought, you know, naively that writing fiction was just writing a story, and I discovered that it's a completely different animal altogether, and so But in the story, in the prophecies, I use the Lenormand cards
Yes.
as you know, at the beginning of of their relationship, as it were, because that seemed to fit somehow.
Yes.
Well, it fitted because the story of Madame Lenormand, who couldn't prophesy her own end. She ended up at the Bastille or something like that. And so I think that the idea of a seer who can't see their own future is an interesting one.
Is it one you subscribe to, or do you do readings for yourself?
I kind of have that approach. I think it was Jung. I mean, Jung, who said something like, "I'm just." What did he say? I'm just trying to find my way in the dark. I think he said, "I'm just an old black man trying to find my way in the dark." Actually, or maybe just just his idea of identifying with a kind of a simple person close to the earth, trying to find my way in the dark, not trying to see into the future. So I don't use I tend not to.
Right.
And I don't know why. I think I've developed quite a complex spread for drilling down deep into a problem that I developed into a sort of workshop that is online with Linda Marson, who runs the Global Spiritual Studies, and there's a sort of two DVD series that I did for her, where we did a webinar sort of workshop, and I sort of presented in there. So in very intractable, difficult problems, I have used, but luckily, thank God, that doesn't. I'm not faced with too many of them. Yeah. I think that's the thing. I think the thing with divination techniques is to sort of know when to use them and to use them sparingly, actually. And like all these sort of rules that one can say, they're made to be broken. And I'm sure there are people who like to use it a lot and it helps them a lot. But I just find that for myself in my own life, I like to use divination tools sparingly, just very occasionally.
Yeah. I mean, I tend to use it a fair bit more, but not necessarily in the sense of divination, more, what would be a good focus for me for this week or something like that. Almost a bit like you're saying about, what's the nub of what's going on at the moment, because, you pull the same card 2 different days and you read it totally differently depending on what's going on for you. So it's more that kind of a way to, in some ways, bring a space for reflection as well. Just the fact that you're stopping to take the time to shuffle the cards, to draw a card, to look at it, to think about it. I think just making that space for yourself is one of the biggest powers of doing a reading for yourself in that way. Yes,
absolutely. What I tend to do for that is when we do a Samhain ritual, around the 31st of October, and when Stephanie and I do our sort of private one, we pick an animal oracle card to be our, with Samhain around the end of October, you're going into this period up to the winter solstice, and then the light is reborn and you go into a new cycle. So it's a kind of limbo land, just that part of the year, and it's nice to have an animal guide through that. So we'll pick an animal card for that period, to see us through. Yeah.
So we were talking before about kind of favourite cards, and I think you've pulled out a few.
Yes, and there's this. I don't know whether you can see. Can you see it on the screen? I don't know if it sort of works.
Yes, I think that works well. Yeah.
Yes, but I think that the sort of sensitivity and the love really in that card.
She kind of cradles it.
She's cradling the skull. Yes. So and there's this light dawn, and there's probably one can't see in detail there, but on the horizon there's a dolmen with the dawn sky. So there's that idea of the new life that's coming. And then for instance, this one of the 8 of Pentacles here where he's forging those pentacles with metal. It's just iron. It's just I just love the warmth of the fire in that imagery that Will's done.
Glowing, yes.
Yes, and then for instance, temperance, which we've called the feralt. There's this idea of the Druid alchemists called the feralt.
Yes.
And there you've got Glastonbury Tor in the distance, and the temperance, the sort of the water flowing from one cup to the other, the idea of this movement of content between the conscious and the unconscious, and the masculine and feminine sides, and so on. And there, it's depicted in this lovely image of, and then there's the rainbow in the background as well, and the two fires of the red and white springs in Glastonbury, red and white energy flowing between them.
Wonderful, yeah.
Yeah.
So yes, those are some really wonderful cards. And so in this also you mentioned the Opera Tarot, and is that out now or just about to come out?
It's just about to come out. It's going to come out in February, so next month, and it's been produced by the artist herself. So it's a beautiful sort of production. There's this sort of heavy box, and then you can see inside there's all these wonderful sort of images from the suits and so on. Wow. And then the cards are, I've got this wonderful, it's all covered in rose gold, which is rather sort of operatic in itself, slightly over the top in an operatic way, which is and it's this idea, that opera, well, it means the work, doesn't it? Opera is work, and it was used in alchemy, this idea of the great work. So what really excited me about the idea of combining opera and tarot is they both, the way the tarot emerged in Renaissance Italy, and around the same time that opera emerged. So historically, they're in the same place, same time.
I didn't
so
realize.
they're coming out of the same, sort of born out of the same culture, and yes, and then there's a book, that I've written in conjunction with the artist Linda, and then it's also. There's the same book, but in Italian too.
Okay. She just wanted it to be in Italian because of the Italian roots of opera, or?
Yes, she has a house in Italy and she loves Italy, and so we did a sort of bilingual edition.
Amazing. Yeah, lovely. So that will be available through her website, or?
Through her website and through the website, through my website as well, philipcargomm.com.
Okay.
Yes. From February, and it's just a limited edition. And it's this idea of, the way in opera, everything tends to be exaggerated, with great drama and color and all the rest of it. And so we've taken this idea of the scenes in our life, the dramas that occur.
Right.
Let's take scenes from opera to illustrate those dramas. They might be a little more colorful than what happens at home. It might be not quite so operatic when you're having a row with your partner or whatever. But it gets the point across strongly.
Yes. I mean, it's that archetypal energy that, the archetypes can be seen in many different layers and levels. And so, yes, that is the most emotional and vibrant version of those experiences.
Yes. Yeah. And in a way, it helps in the process of, if we can, say in therapy, if you can help somebody to act out and even exaggerate the emotions they're feeling or the drama they're describing, you get this interesting process of being able to disidentify from it. Yeah. You suddenly can sort of take a step back and you can see it in an objective light by actually dramatizing it and exaggerating it.
And I think that's another of the things really with tarot. It's a way of you're putting something out there and you can project your own vision onto that thing, but it's outside of yourself. So once again, it's that way of getting that bit of distance and perspective that works equally. Yeah. So this kind of brings both of those aspects into it. It sounds fabulous.
Yeah.
So what do you have on your work table currently then?
Well, what I've become interested in over the last year, really, in how many people have difficulties with sleep. About a third of the adult population have problems sleeping, and that's creeping down the age line, so more and more younger people, as more kids have mobile phones and use social media, younger and younger people are having problems with sleeping.
Yeah.
And, if you're interested in consciousness and levels of consciousness and the personality and the human psyche and the journey of the soul and all that, all fits together. So I thought, what would happen if one took a scientific understanding of sleep, there's a neuroscience of sleep and sleep problems, and then also took, what the ancient wisdom traditions and what a spiritual understanding might bring. What if you brought these two perspectives together? And so back in February last year, I asked on Facebook if anybody had difficulties sleeping and if they'd like to join a private closed group to work on that. And in 24 hours, 140 people volunteered. And so we took a journey together over 6 weeks of trying out techniques and exercises with them and audio recordings, and then getting feedback from everybody. So it was a fantastic time. And then I refined and developed the program from that feedback. And then I put it up on a online course for people called thesleepclinic.org.uk. And it's a program that takes you through 6 weeks of video material and audio material. So there are 16 audio recordings and a bunch of little short films taking you through a program to help you sleep better.
Wonderful.
And it really seems to work for lots of people. I got lots of lovely feedback. And people can try it out, and you can try it out, and if it doesn't work for you, you can have your money back, and it's not expensive anyway. But it's trying to use this new technology we have of the internet to deliver this material. And so that's been going well. And so what's happened out of that is I've been invited. There's a chain of bakers in Brighton who have 5 bakeries around Brighton, and they invited me to come in and talk to the staff about sleep problems.
Right.
And that was tremendous fun. And then a prison system has invited me to come. But prisoners have tremendous trouble sleeping too. And so they're looking at using the program in a prison now to pilot that and to see whether that helps the prisoners.
Fascinating
stuff. So that's what I'm working on.
And is that kind of related to the sophrology side of things as well, bringing that in? Or
Yeah, absolutely. I've trained in a technique called sophrology, which is a mind-body training system that's been around for about 50 years. And it developed in France. It's huge in France. It's very interesting, and it never has really crossed the language barrier. So because I was married to a French lady for 17 years and speak French, and so I was always familiar with it, and so I trained in it. And in France, there are institutes in it. It's used for cancer patients, in obstetrics, in schools for helping kids with exam anxiety and so on.
Excellent.
And what it does is it's a fusion really of sort of an understanding of neuroscience. It was developed by a neuropsychiatrist, and it combines a scientific understanding with really material from yoga and Buddhism, mindfulness, and the reason it's interesting, I think, is because what you do basically is you develop exercises for people. You can tailor them to individuals. So you listen to the individuals. So like in an ordinary counseling session, you hear what the problem is, and then you put together an exercise for them, and then you run them through it using your phone, or their phone rather, so they can record it.
Right.
And they can then leave the session with a recording on their phone that they can listen to. And the exercises are brief. They're just around 10, 15 minutes.
Nice.
So really nice. So you can, even in the busiest day, I had a client the other day who was a guy who worked in the city, very busy man, very demanding, flying around a lot and all the rest of it. And you can fit that into any kind of schedule.
Yeah.
And it combines really very simple body movement with breathing exercises and visualization. and you kind of bundle those together and create any number of different sort of exercises to deal with phobias, anxiety, sleep difficulties, and so on. So the course that I've done combines material from sophrology with material from Yoga Nidra, which is the sort of yogic sleep idea.
Yes.
And so what I hope to do, I rather like these online courses. I think they're great the way they combine different sort of modes of audio and vision and so on. So I'm working on one on meditation too.
Lovely.
Yeah.
And does that kind of swing into the bardic, druidic side as well with the meditation?
Well, yes. What happens with the interesting thing about the whole Druid stream of teaching is it can sound very sort of archaic and eccentric if you don't know about it or know very little about it. But actually, it really speaks to the sort of condition we are in today, because it's a nature way. It's a path of nature spirituality. So it's centered around opening ourselves to the power of nature, which we need so much now in our sort of stressful urban lives and so on. And it starts off working with this idea of story, so opening people to their own biographies, which, as we know from psychotherapy, is a huge step in the right direction when you get people to to perform this sort of paradoxical task of owning their story, really getting to know it and not being in denial about certain aspects of it, but really owning it and coming to know it and embrace it and take responsibility for it. And then also doing the paradoxical about faith, which is also getting off the storyline, which is also not being controlled by it, letting go of certain programming that you've received in the past. Yeah. And that's a very bardic thing, and so in the sort of the bardic training, so what I'm doing as well is I've started a thing called Tea with Philip, which is every Monday evening on Facebook Live on the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids Facebook site. Somebody said to me, you should try Facebook Live, and it's rather extraordinary. You just press a button and suddenly you're talking to lots of people, and there's this amazing feeling of being in contact with people all around the world. And so I experimented with it, and it was great fun. So I'm doing it every Monday at 8:00 in the evening. Right. And sort of thousands of people pile in. It's just amazing. It's just quite extraordinary.
Everyone and having tea together and learning.
Yeah, and I called it Tea with Philip to signal that it's informal, and there's nothing worse than people who take themselves too seriously and it becomes all pompous and all the rest of it. So it's informal, and it's trying to have a conversation, and of course it's a bit skewed, because it's me talking. But you can comment. People type in their comments on the side,
so you can answer questions and have a bit of a dialogue.
Absolutely, that's it. So there's a sense of a conversation, and then it goes up on YouTube and goes up on my blog, and people can add in more comments and ideas and so on. And
in some ways, it almost sounds like the coming around full circle, and being a bit like what you did when you were going to visit your Druid mentor all those many years ago.
Oh, do you know, Chloe, I hadn't thought of that. The cup of tea. Yes, because that was the first thing. Because it was a very sort of formal relationship, because here's this sort of 16-year-old boy turning up at this guy's house, and he was in his 60s, and he would open the door and he'd say, hello, and he'd say, the next thing, would you like a cup of tea? Yes, so he would then make a cup of tea. And then we would just get to work, and he would just talk to me about the Druids and Stonehenge and all that. No personal conversation, because, back in the 60s and between the generations, you wouldn't say, how are you, or, how's your mum, or none of that. It was just straight to work, talk for about an hour, and then I'd go, Yeah. And so, yes, tea with yes, it's talking over a cup of tea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that sounds absolutely lovely. I have actually seen a couple of the videos up on YouTube, and they are.
Oh, did you?
Yes. So yes, very enjoyable and interesting. So also to be recommended.
And somebody suggested that I kept turning into a sort of moving licorice all sorts, because those You know, there's little brightly coloured sweets, Bassett's licorice also. Because the broadband connection isn't always great, suddenly I turn into this sort of bizarre coloured, pixelated thing, you know. But it doesn't seem to matter because it's mainly the sound, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you ever so much for taking this time to speak with me. It's been absolutely fascinating and a real pleasure.
A real pleasure, Chloe. Thank you. Thank you.